The office was never this still. By the time most of my coworkers had shut down their computers and slipped into the night, I was still at my desk, the glow of my monitor the only companion to the soft hum of the air conditioning. Papers were spread out before me in neat little piles, my pen tapping lightly as I tried to fight the sluggishness of a late evening. I told myself I was staying late for the sake of finishing reports, but the truth was simpler than that. Staying late had become routine. Quiet hours were easier, calmer. And sometimes she was still here. My boss. She wasn't the kind of woman you could ignore. Even in a flurry of the daytime office, she carried herself with the kind of effortless composure that made people straighten their backs when she walked by. But tonight, the atmosphere made her feel different. Human. I noticed her a few desks away, reviewing documents under the soft glow of her desk lamp. Her blazer was folded over the back of her chair, leaving her in a simple blouse with the sleeves rolled neatly at her elbows. A strand of hair had slipped loose from the tidy style she usually wore, brushing against her cheek as she leaned forward to make notes in the margin. The sound of her pen scratching against paper was rhythmic, oddly soothing. And with the office so empty, that sound seemed closer, more intimate than it should have been. I shifted slightly in my chair, pretending to refocus on my screen, though my attention kept drifting back toward her. There was something about the way her presence filled the silence. It didn't feel intimidating like it did during the day. Instead, it was warm, quietly magnetic. Still at it. Her voice broke the silence, low and smooth, carrying across the room like a private conversation. I looked up, startled, though her tone wasn't scolding. It was almost teasing. She leaned back in her chair, pen still twirling between her fingers. Yeah, I admitted, giving a small smile. Trying to get this last report done. Figured it'd be easier without the noise of the whole team. Her lips curved in a faint smile, and for a brief second, her eyes softened in a way I hadn't seen before. She set the pen down and stood, walking toward my desk. The sound of her heels was muted against the carpet, but every step seemed to echo in my chest. When she reached my desk, she didn't stand on the other side, as she normally would. Instead, she leaned a hand lightly on the edge, close enough that I could see the faint shimmer of her bracelet under the lamp's glow. Dedicated, she said softly, almost like she was talking to herself. I tried to laugh it off, but the warmth of her nearness made it hard to find the words. My monitor glowed between us, but it was her I couldn't look away from, the loosened strand of hair, the subtle tiredness in her eyes, and the way her voice carried a gentleness I wasn't used to hearing during the day. For the first time, the late office didn't feel empty. It felt charged, like the night itself was holding its breath. She didn't go back to her desk. Instead, she pulled the chair from the corner of my workstation and slid it close, settling across from me like we were equals working side by side. It was such a small act, but it changed everything. The professional distance I had always kept felt like it dissolved in that moment. Her blazer still hung on the back of her chair, leaving her in that simple blouse, the sleeves rolled up just enough to show the delicate line of her forearms. She crossed one leg over the other, her foot brushing lightly against the base of my desk as she leaned in. "You've been staring at those numbers long enough," she said, her tone carrying a softness that didn't quite match the sharp authority she usually wore in daylight. "Let me take a look." I hesitated, sliding the report toward her. She reached for it, her hand brushing mine briefly in the exchange. It was nothing, really, an ordinary accident. But the warmth of her skin stayed with me longer than it should have, a quiet spark racing through my chest before I forced myself to look back at my screen. She studied the paper, tapping her pen lightly against the margin. I couldn't help but notice how close she had leaned in, how the faint citrus of her perfume lingered in the small space between us. Every detail seemed amplified in the silence. The faint rustle of the pages, the way the light caught on the thin silver band she wore on her finger, the rhythm of her quiet breaths. "You're thorough," she said at last, her eyes flicking up to meet mine. There was something in her gaze, steady, unreadable, but softer than I expected. You don't miss much. I felt my cheeks warm, and I gave a small laugh. Trying to keep up with your standards. Her lips curved, just enough to show amusement, though it faded quickly into something gentler. She rested her elbow on the desk, her chin balanced on her hand as she studied me for a moment longer than felt casual. In daylight, I knew her as the woman who kept meetings sharp, who rarely wasted a second of anyone's time. But here, under the quiet glow of a desk lamp, she wasn't my boss in the same way. She was just a woman sitting across from me, tired yet graceful, carrying herself with the weight of someone who never let herself rest until others did. I caught myself staring too long and quickly looked back down at the report. My hand shifted on the page at the same moment hers did, and our fingers brushed again, this time lingering just a second longer. Not intentional, but not hurried either. The silence stretched, charged, and delicate. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer still. You make late nights less unbearable. I swallowed, unsure if she meant it lightly or if it carried the weight I thought I heard. Either way, I couldn't stop the quiet smile tugging at my lips. For the first time, it felt like the walls between us weren't made of titles and roles. They were thinning, giving way to something that didn't belong in the office at all. By the time I finished typing the last line of the report, the office had grown even quieter. The hum of the computers felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were leaning in, listening. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled, rubbing my eyes. Done? She asked, her voice low, carrying across the silence. I nodded. Finally. She didn't return to her own work. Instead, she drifted closer, standing just behind me. I could feel her presence without looking. Her nearness stirred the air, warming the stillness. The faintest trace of her perfume reached me, citrus and something floral, subtle but unmistakable. I adjusted in my seat, my heartbeat picking up against the unnatural quiet. I was used to hearing her voice from across a meeting table or over the clatter of an office filled with people. But here, with her standing so close, the sound of her breathing seemed impossibly loud. She leaned forward, her hand resting lightly on the back of my chair. The proximity sent a shiver down my spine. Her presence wasn't imposing, though. It was careful, almost tender, like she was testing a boundary neither of us had acknowledged before. And then, in a whisper so soft it felt like it was meant only for me, she said, "Consider this your reward for staying late." The words sank deep, curling through me like fire. I froze, caught between confusion and the unmistakable warmth that surged in my chest. I turned slightly in my chair, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were steady, but there was something different in them, something that didn't belong to a boss addressing her employee. It wasn't playful exactly, nor was it fully serious. It was layered, an invitation, a test, and maybe even a confession, all wrapped in one quiet sentence. For a moment, neither of us moved. The office was utterly still, the air thick with a silence that wasn't empty at all. It was charged. I could feel the warmth of her hand on the chair, radiating just inches from my shoulder, the soft brush of her blouse, sleeve almost grazing against me. My throat tightened. I searched for words, but none came. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving in the faintest smile, as if she knew the effect she'd had. And yet, there was hesitation there too. A flicker of vulnerability, quickly masked, but real enough to catch. I stammered, forcing a small laugh to lighten the weight pressing down between us. That's a new kind of bonus system. Her laugh came soft, almost a sigh, but it didn't break the tension. It deepened it. When she straightened, she didn't step away right away. Her hand lingered on the back of my chair a moment longer, her eyes searching mine. And in that instant, the line between us felt thinner than ever, fragile enough to be crossed with nothing more than a breath. I didn't cross it, neither did she, but the moment stayed, like an invisible mark between us, impossible to erase. The tension of her whisper still lingered in the air, and yet she shifted the moment with a kind of graceful ease, like she just pulled back a curtain before it grew too heavy. "Coffee?" she asked softly, lifting a sleek silver thermos from her desk. I blinked, surprised. "You brought your own?" She smiled faintly, unscrewing the cap. "Office coffee is undrinkable after 6. Learned that years ago." The rich, dark scent filled the space as she poured into the small lid cup and slid it toward me. The warmth seeped into my palms as I held it, a comfort against the cool hum of the air-conditioned room. For a moment, we simply sat there, sipping in silence. The glow of the desk lamp pooled around us, making the office feel smaller, softer, like the rest of the world had disappeared outside those glass walls. "You know," she said eventually, her voice quieter than before, "I don't usually stay this late anymore. I tell myself I'm past that stage of needing to prove something." But then, she gave a small shrug, swirling the coffee in her cup. "Old habits don't die so easily." I studied her carefully. There was something in her tone, something I hadn't heard before. Less polished, more human. "You still carry the whole place on your shoulders," I said, "even when no one notices." She tilted her head at me, eyes narrowing just slightly, as if my words had struck deeper than I realized. Then, to my surprise, her expression softened into something almost wistful. "It's easier to let people think I'm unshakable," she murmured. "But some nights it feels heavier than I want to admit." Her confession hung there, delicate, fragile. I wanted to say something to ease that weight, or at least to acknowledge it, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, instinct moved me. A loose strand of hair had slipped across her cheek, and without thinking, I reached out gently and brushed it back behind her ear. Her breath caught, just faintly but enough that I felt it. I froze, suddenly aware of how intimate the gesture was. But she didn't pull away. Instead, her lips curved into the softest of smiles, one that didn't quite reach her eyes but seemed grateful all the same. "Thank you," she whispered. We went quiet again, but it wasn't the heavy silence of awkwardness. It was something else, an unspoken understanding, fragile yet real. The kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Her laugh, when it finally came, was gentle and low. "You're easy to talk to, easier than most." I felt warmth spread through me, stronger than the coffee in my hands. In that moment, the office wasn't an office. It was a quiet room where two people had set their roles aside, if only for a while. And for the first time, I sensed the faint outline of something neither of us had dared to name. The reports were finished, the coffee nearly gone, yet neither of us made a move to leave. The hour was late enough that the office lights beyond our corner had shut off, leaving only the soft glow of her desk lamp illuminating us in a warm pool of light. She leaned closer to point something out on my screen, her chair drawn beside mine now, so close that I could feel the brush of her sleeve against my arm. It was nothing unusual in gesture, just a simple act of explanation, but the proximity changed everything. Her hand rested lightly on my shoulder as she leaned in, steadying herself while she traced a line on the screen with her finger. The touch was casual, professional even, yet my entire body registered it with startling clarity. The warmth of her palm through the thin fabric of my shirt, the delicate pressure that lingered just long enough to stir something deep in my chest. I nodded along to her words, though I wasn't truly hearing them. My attention was trapped elsewhere, on the low cadence of her voice, so close to my ear, on the way a few strands of her hair slipped forward, brushing against my cheek where she leaned closer still. And then there was the silence. She stopped mid-sentence, her finger pausing on the screen. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she pulled her hand back from my shoulder, but not all the way. Her fingertips lingered, sliding down to rest briefly against the top of my arm. The smallest gesture, but it sent a current through me so strong it was hard to breathe. I turned my head slightly, and suddenly our faces were far too close. Her lips parted just barely, as if words hovered there but couldn't quite escape. My heart hammered, louder than the hum of the computers, louder than the faint city sounds beyond the glass. I searched her eyes, and for the first time, I saw something I never expected. Hesitation. Vulnerability. She drew in a slow breath. Her voice was soft, uncertain, her gaze flicking between my eyes and my mouth. Sometimes I wonder if she stopped. Her lips pressed together, her lashes lowering for the briefest second before she looked away, shaking her head lightly, as if to chase off the thought. I wanted to ask, wonder what, but the weight of the moment held me still. Maybe she wasn't ready to finish the sentence. Maybe saying it aloud would break whatever fragile thread was holding us together right now. The silence stretched, heavy and charged. My hand shifted instinctively toward hers, close enough that if I moved another inch, our fingers would touch. But I didn't. Neither of us did. Instead, she exhaled quietly, retreating just enough to sit back in her chair, though her eyes lingered on mine with an unspoken intensity. The words she almost said hovered between us like ghosts. And though she hadn't confessed them, I felt them, clear as if she had. The moment between us had quieted, but it hadn't dissolved. If anything, the silence felt even more alive now, charged with all the words she hadn't spoken and all the ones I was too afraid to say. She glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at me, and her expression softened. "You've done enough for tonight," she murmured, her voice carrying a note of finality, but also something warmer, something that didn't quite belong to work. I saved the last document on my screen and shut the laptop with a soft click. For a long second, neither of us moved. The pool of lamplight seemed to hold us in place, like the world outside the office didn't exist. "You stayed longer than you should have," she said after a pause. "I mean it when I say I appreciate it." The sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. I looked up, and she wasn't wearing her usual guarded composure. Her eyes held mine steadily, and for the first time, I saw them without that protective shield of professionalism. They looked tired, yes, but also vulnerable, like she was letting me see something few people ever did. She reached out, almost hesitantly, and laid her hand against my arm. It was such a simple gesture, but the warmth of her touch spread through me like fire in the quiet night. Then, before I could speak, she stepped closer. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were giving me every chance to step back. But I didn't. Her hand slid gently down my sleeve, and then, hesitating only for a heartbeat, she let her cheek rest against my shoulder. My entire body froze, not from discomfort, but from the overwhelming rush of awareness. The soft weight of her leaning into me, the faint brush of her hair against my jaw, the quiet steadiness of her breath, warm and measured, so close I could feel it. For a moment, I didn't breathe at all. Then, slowly, I let myself lean into the closeness, my chest rising against hers in the softest rhythm. I lowered my hand, covering hers where it still rested on my arm. My touch was gentle, cautious, but when my fingers curled lightly over hers, she didn't move away. Instead, I felt the faintest shift in her body, like the smallest sigh of relief, as if she'd been holding herself taut and was finally allowing herself to rest. The office around us was silent, except for the hum of the machines and the faint echo of the city outside. But between us, there was something louder, unspoken and undeniable. I closed my eyes for just a second, letting the reality of it sink in. The woman I had admired from a distance, respected from across polished meeting tables, was now here, close enough that I could feel the beating of her heart against my shoulder. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't anything dramatic. It was quieter than that, but maybe more powerful because of it. Because in that small, fragile gesture, something had shifted forever. We didn't speak for a long while. Her cheek rested against my shoulder, my hand still lightly covering hers, and in that silence, everything felt unshakably real. The office, so often a place of noise and routine, had transformed into something almost sacred, a space that held a secret only we now shared. Eventually, she stirred, straightening slowly, her hand slipping away from mine with a reluctance I could almost feel. She smoothed a loose strand of hair back into place, a small attempt at composure, though her eyes betrayed the softness she was trying to regain. "It's late," she said gently, glancing toward the darkened hallway beyond our corner. "We should head out before they turn the lights off on us." I nodded, my throat dry, unable to summon much more than that. We packed in silence, the sound of closing laptops and shuffled papers filling the room. Yet even those ordinary actions seemed different now, more deliberate, like each movement carried the weight of everything unspoken between us. She walked beside me as we made our way to the elevators. The corridor was dim, lined with the glow of emergency lights, the world outside reduced to the faint glitter of city streets far below. At the elevator doors, we paused. The stainless steel reflected a faint version of us standing side by side, close but not touching. She turned to me then, her expression unreadable for a moment, caught somewhere between professional restraint and the vulnerability she had shown earlier. Her eyes searched mine, as if weighing whether to leave the night exactly as it was, or to give me something more. Her lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "You know," she whispered, her voice low enough that it felt like it belonged only to me, "maybe we should stay late more often." The words struck me like a chord, quiet but resonant. I didn't laugh, though I could have. I didn't deflect with something lighthearted. Instead, I simply held her gaze, letting the truth of her suggestion sink in. The unspoken promise that tonight wasn't an accident, but a beginning. The elevator chimed softly. She stepped in first, then turned back, her hand brushing against mine in the subtlest of touches as I joined her. The contact was fleeting, but it lingered in me long after, leaving a warmth that refused to fade. We stood side by side as the doors closed, the hum of the elevator filling the quiet. She didn't move closer, and neither did I, but the closeness was already there, woven into the silence, into the memory of her leaning into me, into the words she had just offered. When the doors opened to the lobby, the cool night air waited beyond the glass entrance, carrying the sounds of a city that hadn't paused for us. Yet I felt changed, as if the world outside had shifted slightly because of what had happened within those quiet office walls. We stepped out together, side by side, not as boss and employee anymore, but as two people carrying a secret warmth that neither time nor rules could erase. And though no one else would notice it in the way we walked, I knew. We both knew. This was only the beginning.